Everyone says the past should stay buried, but we know some truths refuse to stay quiet. Today is the story of a man whose deepest scars became his greatest strength. In the wide, unforgiving American West, it all began with one small act of defiance. Before we kick off this adventure, don't forget to hit like on the video and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. The saloon doors gave their familiar groan, loud enough to mark an arrival, soft enough not to break the spell. Inside, Hale's quiet warmth settled over the tired like a wool blanket fresh off the line. Amber lamplight slid across the bar's polished grain whiskey glasses, chimed gently, and an old upright piano wrestled its way through a jaunty tune beneath the calloused hands of a ranch hand named Otis Lane. Laughter bloomed in pockets loose and unguarded. Behind the bar stood Garrick Hale, one hand working a rag, the other steadying a glass. His movements were slow practiced, almost meditative. Folks called him Quiet Hale, not for coldness or pride, but because in a town crowded with tall tales, he never offered one of his own. His smile stayed small, even like something learned long ago. His voice rarely rose above a murmur. For 15 years he'd poured drinks and cooled tempers in Hollow Ridge. Some claimed he'd drifted in from the east, others swore he'd seen a war. No one ever proved either. Garrick never corrected anyone. That evening, as dusk bled across the canyon rim like spilled ink, the saloon's warmth felt like a promise that here at least the world stayed gentle. Then came the hoofbeats. Boots struck hard outside. Dust lifted. The piano faltered and died. Conversations froze as if the floorboards themselves sensed what was coming. 5 men pushed through the swinging doors in black dusters' spurs ringing sharp. Their guns stayed holstered, but loose worn the way men wear confidence. At their center walked a younger man with too much swagger and not enough past Dorian Cress. He smiled like someone used to taking what didn't belong to him. Even in Hollow Ridge, he drawled arms, spreading wide preacher style. Heard this little joint holds the pride of the canyon. No one laughed. Garrick lifted his eyes, once gave the barest nod, then went back to polishing the glass. Dorian stepped closer, his hand drifting near his holster, as if by habit. "How about this?" Dorian said. "Everyone clears out. Me and my boys take it from here." Silence settled thick. The Hollow Ridge folk hesitated. A few stood, most stayed rooted. Garrick spoke at last, his tone smooth, steady as creek water. "That's not how things work here." Dorian tilted his head, smile thinning. "I'm not asking how they work. I'm telling you how they're gonna." Garrick didn't flinch. His voice never rose. "They can't stay. Or you can leave." Behind Dorian, one of the Crest guns shifted, fingers twitching. The room felt charged like dry brush waiting on a spark. Dorian laughed instead, a short, sharp bark that sliced the quiet. "All right then," he said, turning to his men. "Let's be neighborly. For now." They took a table in the back, boots up, drinking like they owned the ground beneath their chairs. The music never came back. Talk returned only in hushed tones. By midnight, they were gone. The saloon exhaled unsteady but standing. Garrick said nothing. He scrubbed the bar, gathered empty bottles, and locked the doors after the last patron, while the desert wind began to rise. The sky darkened to the color of burned coal. Hollow Ridge settled into its uneasy night. Coyotes called from the distance. Somewhere far off, a lone horse cried into the dark. The smell of smoke came first. Garrick Hale opened his eyes before the knock ever reached his door. The small room above Hale's quiet held little, just a narrow bed, a single chair, and an old photograph he never wiped clean. He swung his legs down, pulled on his boots, and stepped onto the balcony. Fire crawled out from beneath the saloon's porch, tongues of flame snapping upward with hungry purpose. Whoever set it had done the job proper, kerosene soaked deep into the planks, hay packed tight into barrels. By the time the church bell began to ring, the fight was already lost. The Hollow Ridge folk rushed in with buckets and blankets, forming desperate lines from the well. But the fire mocked their effort, climbing higher with every breath it took. Glass burst, beams gave way. The piano cried one last crooked note before vanishing into the blaze. Garrick stood at the edge of the ruin arms, loose at his sides, smoke curling past his shoulders. His face showed nothing, no anger, no fear, no grief. Only a calm stillness, like a man meeting a truth he'd been expecting all along. Sheriff Nolan Brace stepped up beside him, ash streaking his worn features. "I'm sorry, Garrick." Garrick didn't turn from the flames. It was a message he said quietly. They didn't burn it for sport. They burned it for me. The townsfolk kept moving even when it became clear there was nothing left to save. Etta Winslow, still in her nightdress, passed water and snapped orders. Children cried, dogs barked, fire danced. Garrick never moved. The last ember died just before dawn. Hale's quiet folded in on itself like an exhausted animal finally giving up. What remained was a blackened frame and a broken sign half hanging where the name once stood. Garrick walked forward, slow and deliberate boots crunching over scorched ground that had been home. He lifted a shard of the bar's mirror and held it to the gray light. His reflection stared back through soot and smoke. Older, harder. He let the glass fall. Behind him, the town stood silent. No one asked what he would do next. No one offered words meant to heal. They waited, watching for something in his eyes to fracture to give. Nothing did. Only the wind carrying smoke west, and the sight of Garrick Hale standing where his life had burned away, staring into dawn, with a face cut from stone and eyes colder than the fire that took it. Morning came slow to Hollow Ridge, as if the sun itself hesitated to look upon a town buried in ash and grief. Soot drifted through the streets, like dark snow settling in hair, clinging to coats, seeping into every breath. Where music and laughter once spilled from Hale's quiet, there was now only a hollow shell of charred beams and shattered bottles. People passed by carefully, as though the ruins might still bite. Their voices stayed low-edged with more judgment than pity. "He should have let him have it," muttered Vernon Pike, shaking his head. "No sense standing up to wolves when you ain't got teeth left." Others remembered things differently. They recalled the bartender's quiet presence, the way he never raised his voice, never wore a gun. Yet somehow stopped fights cold, with nothing more than a steady look. They remembered how Garrick had come to Hollow Ridge 15 years earlier, walking out of the desert with a single bag and no explanation. A man who never boasted, never swung first, but never bent either. Now that silence felt heavier, whispered over buckets of water and the slow sweep of ash. Who had he been before he arrived here? Sheriff Nolan Brace rapped his knuckles against the charred frame of Garrick's doorway, though there was no door left to answer. His badge caught the pale morning light, dulled and worn, much like the man himself, polished down by years of keeping order with little more than words. Garrick Nolan said quietly, his voice rough as gravel, "I'm sorry." Garrick stood inside the ruins boots, planted on scorched planks, staring at the ghosted outline where his bar once stood. He didn't turn. "Town's talking," Nolan went on. "They think you ought to move on. Ain't safe for you here anymore." Still nothing. Nolan shifted his hand, brushing the holster at his side. "You know I can't protect you," he admitted. "Truth is, I can't protect half this place from the Cress outfit." Dorian cress is the kind that doesn't quit till the ground's empty or full of graves. Garrick finally lifted his gaze not to Nolan, but to the thin, bitter smoke curling into the sky. "I built this place with my own hands," he said, voice low and steady. "I'm not leaving because some boy thinks fire makes him a man." Nolan let out a slow breath, nodding as the worry carved deeper lines into his face. "Then God help you, Garrick." Word spread quick that the bartender wouldn't bend. The Hollow Ridge folk set about salvaging what little they could from the ashes, and memories rose with the smoke times when Garrick had been more than a man behind the counter. They softened when she saw Garrick. She picked her way across the rubble and stopped beside him. "You should have let them take it," she said softly, half scolding, half ache. "A saloon's just boards and nails. You could build again." Garrick didn't answer. Etta studied him, seeing the stillness that hid something heavier underneath. At last she asked the question the town only whispered. "What were you before this, Garrick?" The words hung between them like smoke. Garrick's jaw tightened, eyes fixed on the blackened beams. He gave no reply. After a long moment, Etta sighed, her shoulders easing. She rested a hand on his arm. "Whoever you were," she said gently, "I hope you still are." By the next morning, the Cress outfit rode back into town. They didn't creep in this time with cans of kerosene and dark intentions. They came loud and open horses thundering down the street, dust rising in thick clouds that coated the faces of the Hollow Ridge folk forced to step aside. At the center of the square, Dorian Cress ordered a piano dragged out of an abandoned storage shed. Its legs splintered under rough hands as it scraped across the dirt. He had it set right where Hale's quiet once cast its shadow, grinning, wide teeth bared. Then he slammed at the keys, pounding out noise that mocked music more than made it. The Cress guns laughed and clapped along, lifting bottles stolen from what little the general store had left. "Welcome to our new home." Dorian shouted, his voice ringing like a thrown gauntlet. "Hollow Ridge belongs to us now." No one answered. Some townsfolk dropped their eyes. Others clenched their fists. No one moved. That was when Garrick Hale passed through the square, walking the road with an even unhurried stride. Soot dusted his shirt and smoke still clung to his hair. He didn't look at Dorian, didn't glance at the piano. He just kept walking. Dorian spotted him and pushed up from the bench, swagger rolling off him like heat from iron. "Well, I'll be damned," he called out. "If it ain't the quiet barkeep himself. How's it feel, old man, watching your dreams burn like dry kindling?" Garrick kept moving, head slightly lowered, as if Dorian were nothing but wind. The smiles on the gang's faces wavered. Dorian spread his arms wider, his voice sharpening. "Hey, I'm talking to you." Nothing. Garrick stepped past the edge of the square, boots crunching gravel, shoulders straight, pace unchanged. The silence cut deeper than any insult. Dorian spat into the dirt, his face twisting. "Guess that fire burned the spine clean out of you." His men roared with laughter. Garrick didn't slow, didn't turn. He walked on, slipping into the drifting ash like a shadow swallowed by daylight. And in that quiet, hollow ridge felt something stir, not fear, not surrender, but the start of a question no one yet dared to voice. If Garrick Hale wasn't afraid of Dorian Cress, what reason did the rest of them have to be? The church bell rang hollow that Sunday, its sound smothered by dust and dread. Folks filed inside with bent shoulders and lowered heads, as if the weight of the Cress outfit pressed heavier than any sermon. Outside, Dorian and his men lounged against the railings, boots up, rifles across their knees, daring anyone to hold their stare too long. Inside the pews, Whispers traveled how the gang took whiskey without paying, how they cornered June Kell in an alley, until Aaron Kell stepped in, how Sheriff Nolan Brace had stood frozen, hand near his holster, never drawing. By the time the service ended, Asa Kell had already tossed his badge onto the sheriff's desk and left town for good. "You can't fight ghosts with empty hands," he said. "And you can't fight wolves when the sheep won't stand together." The words lingered after he was gone, leaving Nolan alone with the quiet weight of his failure. The Kress outfit grew bolder by the hour. They drifted through the general store, sweeping food from shelves, tipping hats at women too frightened to meet their eyes. They treated Hollow Ridge like a carcass, picked clean, each man tearing off his share, while Dorian smiled like he owned it all. That evening, Dorian rode out to Etta Winslow's ranch. The sun sat low, throwing copper light across the land. He dismounted without asking, stepped into the pen, and grabbed a calf by its rope. "Fine-looking animal," Dorian Kress said, sliding a gloved hand along the calf's back. "Reckon I'll take it off your hands." Etta Winslow didn't budge. Her hands were rough from ranch work, steady as iron. "That calf's for sale," she said. Dorian's grin tightened. He didn't ask about buying it. Etta's palm cracked across his cheek before another word could form. The sound snapped through the yard like a rifle shot. Dorian froze, eyes flaring, his hand twitching toward his belt. He was about to strike her. Everyone saw it coming, then a shadow stepped in. Garrick Hale stood in the dust, silent, as ever, his face unreadable. He didn't raise a fist. He didn't reach for a weapon. He simply placed himself between Dorian and the woman. For a heartbeat, nothing moved. The calf bawled and kicked against the rope. Dorian's fingers hovered near his holster, then dropped. He spat into the dirt, muttered under his breath, and backed off with a sneer. "Ain't worth it," he said. "Not today." When he was gone, Etta's breath shuddered in her chest. She looked at Garrick, searching his stillness for something: gratitude, anger, fear. She found none of it. Only that quiet, heavier than steel. That night she rode hard into town's skirts, snapping in the desert wind, and stormed into the sheriff's office. His hands trembled just barely as he pulled it free. The wrap opened with a dry crackle, revealing a long gun with ivory grips, worn smooth by memory, and a tin star tarnished but whole. Garrick stared for a long moment, his reflection warped in the star's dull shine. Then he closed his eyes, as if bargaining with ghosts only he could see. When he stood again, the desert felt heavier, as though it knew an old burden had been lifted from the ground and set back on his shoulders. Back in town, unease clung to the night. Lamps burned low doors, shut early fear, refusing to leave. Near midnight, 2 of the Kress guns staggered into the square. Bound and gagged, weapons gone, faces bruised. They were tied to their own horses, eyes wide with the shock of men touched by something they couldn't name. No one saw who did it. No one claimed to hear a shot or a struggle. All that spoke were the tight knots and the shame on their faces as they were left to wander the canyon's edge before the Hollow Ridge folk cut them loose. When word reached Dorian Kress, his rage broke like thunder. He stormed through the streets with a pistol in his fist, firing skyward, hurling curses at every door and shutter that dared remain closed. His men fanned out, kicking over barrels, smashing lanterns, barking for answers. Someone thought they were smart. Dorian Kress roared into the night, his voice carrying clear and hard. "Somebody thinks they can play ghost with me. I'll pay silver for the name. Gold for the body," he went on. "Whoever's hiding in the dark, hear me now. We'll smoke you out." His words bounced off the canyon walls and died there. Only the wind answered, slipping through the ashes of Hale's quiet, carrying whispers of a legend not yet spoken, but already feared. The storm arrived first, as a low murmur on the horizon, a distant growl rolling over the mesa. The sky bruised purple and black as Hollow Ridge crouched beneath it, Shutter's tight lamps turned low. Yet no storm above matched the one Dorian Kress dragged through the streets. His boots hammered the boardwalk, his pistol swinging loose as if begging for an excuse. He found Sheriff Nolan Brace outside the post office, speaking with townsfolk who scattered like quail when Dorian closed in. Nolan held his ground, though his shoulders sagged with years of wear and defeat. Dorian's shadow fell long and jagged across him in the dying light. "Which one of your rats is playing ghost in my canyon?" Dorian snapped. "Give me names, Sheriff." "Now." Nolan's jaw set. He shook his head once slow, certain. "Ain't anyone here gonna give you what you want." The words had barely left his mouth when Dorian's pistol cracked against his temple. Nolan dropped to his knees, blood streaking his face as dust puffed up around him. Gasps rose from behind curtains and door frames. No one stepped in, too afraid to move, too ashamed to look away. Dorian cocked the hammer, pressing the barrel to Nolan's skull. "You're protecting him," he said. "You know who it is." Silence stretched, broken only by the first rumble of thunder overhead. Then from the far end of the street, footsteps came steady, measured, unhurried. Garrick Hale emerged, framed by the gathering storm. He carried no weapon, only a calm that sat deep in his eyes. He knelt, lifted the sheriff carefully from the dirt, and wiped blood from Nolan's brow. Dorian laughed, though the sound wavered. "There he is, the quiet little barkeep. You know," he went on, "folks keep whispering about you. Like there's iron under all that silence." Garrick didn't answer. He didn't even look at Dorian. He draped Nolan's arm over his shoulder, steadied him, and began to guide him away. The watching crowd murmured. His calm ran too deep, too clean, like a man walking through fire without fear of being burned. Dorian spat into the dust, lowering his gun with a crooked sneer. "Walk while you can, old man. Walk while you can." That night, thunder crept closer, shaking shingles loose from rooftops. Rain began in hesitant drops, then thickened into a hard curtain against Etta Winslow's ranch house. Inside, the fire snapped and popped, casting warm gold across the rough walls. Garrick sat across from her by the hearth shadows flickering over his face. His hands locked together, knuckles pale as if gripping the weight of an entire lifetime. For years he had lived on half-words and silence, letting quiet do the talking. Now at last, his voice came low-measured, stripped of ornament. "They used to call me Garrick Hale." He stared into the fire, as though the flames alone could carry the truth. The name he did not speak hung there all the same, the preacher of Slate Run. Etta Winslow leaned forward, breath caught in her chest. She had heard the story once years ago, passed along the frontier, like a half-believed legend, a lawman who quoted scripture while cutting down killers, a man larger than the churches that tried to claim him. She had never imagined that kind of ghost would spend his days pouring whiskey in Hollow Ridge. "I wore the star," Garrick went on, his voice roughened by memory. "Carried iron in one hand and a sermon in the other." He paused, eyes shining in the firelight, not with tears, but with something heavier. "I thought I could save every soul. Thought God put steel in my grip for justice." Then his jaw tightened. Then Slate Run happened. Men like Dorian Kress, only worse. They came like locusts, left nothing standing. My wife, my boy. His throat closed. The silence that followed was sharper than any word. I buried them myself, buried the badge with them. Swore I'd never draw again. Etta's hand flew to her mouth, trembling. "All these years," she whispered, "you lived like a ghost." Garrick nodded once. "I poured whiskey so I wouldn't have to pour blood. I let the world forget me. Then he turned his gaze steady on hers. But now the Cress outfit is feeding. I can't let evil walk free again. Not here. Outside, the storm battered the ranch shutters, rattling as the wind howled like wolves. Fear filled Etta's eyes, fear and something deeper, the knowledge that she might lose him before she ever truly knew him. She reached across the table, fingers brushing his arm, holding to him, as if he were the only solid thing left. "If you ride out there," she whispered, voice breaking, "you might not come back." Garrick's hand closed over hers, warm and firm, the faintest tremor betraying the truth he never spoke. He leaned in, his words slow, final, as thunder cracked overhead. "Then I'll make sure they don't either." The fire hissed as rain found its way through the roof, dripping onto the logs, pale smoke curling upward. Etta met his eyes and saw no barkeep, no ghost, no broken man. She saw the preacher of Slate Run, returned his silence, no longer a hiding place, but a blade honed to purpose. Outside, the storm gathered its strength, as if the sky itself braced for judgment. The storm broke before dawn, leaving Hollow Ridge washed raw and shaking. Puddles filled wagon ruts, mud slick and black, beneath a sky split open by blood-red light. Smoke still clung to the ruins of Hale's quiet, mingling with wet cedar and the bite of gun oil. From a charred beam that once framed the saloon, a man hung bound tight, mouth gagged, his hat pinned dead center by a single bullet. Terror froze his eyes, pride stripped away, as clean as the soot around him. When Dorian Cress found his second in command, Mercer Rook hanging there as a warning, his face twisted into something barely human. "Mount up," he roared, voice cracking the morning like a whip. "All of you, every last one." 20 saddles creaked, 20 sets of spurs rang, 20 rifles caught the blood-orange dawn. The Cress outfit came thundering toward Hollow Ridge, hooves tearing into the softened ground, the sound rolling ahead of them like war drums. Windows burst inward. Mothers dragged children close. Men who once swore they'd stand their ground now whispered prayers behind bolted doors. At the center of the main street, one man waited alone. No hat shadowed his face. No fear lived in his eyes. Garrick Hale stood with his long gun resting at his side. His boots sank deep into the mud, as if the earth itself had planted him there as its sentry. His coat snapped in the morning wind, and the silence stretched so tight it felt like the whole town was holding its breath. The riders poured in dust, boiling upward as the ground, shuddering beneath their charge. Dorian Cress led them, grinning wide, his pistol spinning in his hand, as if death were nothing more than a trick for show. The Cress guns fanned out across the street, rifles coming up, hooves pounding hard enough to rattle bone and timber alike. Garrick moved first. The long gun sang its report, cracking through the valley like judgment. One rider pitched sideways, a bullet tearing through his shoulder, his rifle clanging uselessly into the mud. Another screamed as his wrist shattered, his weapon spinning away. Garrick fired again and again. Each shot landed true. No wasted lead, no wasted breath. He moved with calm precision, as if the storm locked inside him had finally broken free. Riders fell from their saddles wounded but alive, their guns stripped from them as cleanly as sins torn from a soul. Only when a bullet cut too close, when a rider raised his pistol in blind fury, did Garrick answer without mercy. Those shots struck hard, dropping men lifeless into the muck. From behind doors and windows, townsfolk watched, disbelief swelling into something sharper, something that tasted like hope. A few dared step into the street. When the first outlaw rifle hit the ground, Vernon Pike bent down and grabbed it. His hand shook, but he raised it anyway, covering Garrick's flank. Another man followed, then a boy barely grown, then a farmer with more anger than aim. Gunfire roared, bouncing off storefronts, the church walls, the post office. Garrick cut through smoke and dust like a phantom, every movement deliberate, every shot carrying the weight of a prayer, finally answered. Then a shout rose from down the street. Etta Winslow rode in hard, her dark hair torn loose, her rifle steady in her hands. The Winslow men thundered in behind her, grim-faced eyes blazing. They swung down from their saddles, took cover, and opened fire with a deadly focus born of desperation. Etta dismounted, last boots splashing into the mud, her rifle cracking like thunder at her shoulder. Dorian Kress watched his men fall back one after another until only a ragged few remained. He cursed, fired wild shots, then spurred his horse straight toward the church. He leapt from the saddle and charged inside, dragging his rage with him. Garrick followed without a word. The church lay dark air, thick with dust and old incense. Dorian scrambled up the stairs to the bell tower, boots hammering, wood curses spilling from his mouth. The great bell loomed overhead, silent as a grave storm light bleeding in through the slats. Dorian turned chest, heaving, pistol clenched tight. "You ain't no preacher," he spat, sweat shining on his brow. "Just another killer hiding behind silence." Garrick stepped into the tower, long gun cradled in his arms, his face carved from stone. Rain-lit dawn washed over him, painting him in red. "No," he said quietly, his voice carrying more weight than thunder. "I'll bury you all the same." Dorian Kress screamed, wrenching up his pistol. The shot cracked, splintering wood inches from Garrick Hale's head. Garrick answered a breath later. His round sliced the air and struck true. Dorian lurched the pistol, tumbling from his grip as his body slammed into the bell with a hollow clang that rang across Hollow Ridge like judgment calling time. The street below went still. Faces lifted as the sound rolled through the canyon, echoing off stone and timber, carrying the end of fear on its back. The last of the Kress guns threw down their weapons, some bolting for the desert, others standing, frozen eyes wide and emptied. Garrick stood in the tower, dawn burning around him, the quiet deeper than anything he had ever known. He looked once at Dorian's unmoving form, then out over the town he had tried so long not to claim. The bell swayed again in the wind, its tone soft, mournful, final. When Garrick descended the steps and stepped into the mud, the people of Hollow Ridge no longer saw a quiet barkeep. They saw the legend they had whispered about standing in the light of a new day, a man who buried his past, but would not bury justice. Twilight washed the streets in gold, gentle and forgiving, as if the desert itself meant to erase the violence carved into its bones. Weeks passed from the morning the bell marked Dorian Kress's end, and life returned in earnest. Hammers rang from rooftops. Laughter spilled into alleys once choked by silence. Fresh-cut lumber mixed with mesquite smoke. The Kress outfit had scattered, and the canyon breathed easier. Where Hale's quiet had burned to ash, a new frame rose. Beams stood proud against the evening sky, rough, sturdy, driven together by hands that remembered fear and chose defiance. The town rebuilt plank by plank, not only for whiskey and music, but as proof they had survived. This time the saloon belonged to all of Hollow Ridge. Sheriff Nolan Brace walked slower now, a limp reminding him of Dorian's pistol, but his badge still caught the light. Folks tipped their hats again, not because they believed he could stand alone against wolves, but because they knew he didn't have to. He carried the respect of a town that had found its spine. On the porch of the half-built saloon, Garrick sat in a rocking chair Etta Winslow had dragged out just for him. Boards creaked beneath his boots. The air smelled of sawdust and sweet evening sage. Etta settled beside him, skirts brushing dust hair, catching the last threads of light. She leaned back with a tired sigh, a smile curling, as she watched workmen hammer children chase one another through scrap piles. lanterns blooming one by one. "You know," she said softly, "this place will never be the same." Garrick studied the beams, the rough sign waiting to be hung. "No," he said, "it'll be better." Her eyes lingered on him, on the stillness, the quiet strength that remained even at rest. She brushed his sleeve. "You never told me if you'll stay." His gaze drifted to the horizon, where dark mesas cut against the fading light. "A man runs from ghosts long enough he forgets how to live," he said. "I reckon it's time I stopped running." Etta's hand settled on his arm, firm now without hesitation. "Good. This town needs you, and so do I." For the first time in years, Garrick let himself smile, small but real. Inside, behind the half-finished counter, a locked chest waited. Inside it rested the ivory-handled gun, and the dulled tin star sealed away once more. Garrick Hale had cleaned them carefully before closing the lid, not for use, but for remembrance. He had no need of them now. Justice had been answered, and the weight of steel could sleep again. The sun slid low, washing the desert in crimson before surrendering to indigo. Cicadas thrummed. Night birds called. Lantern lights spread gently across the faces of those who once feared peace would never come. The saloon would rise tomorrow, and the next day, and the next, until it stood whole again. Music would return. Laughter would return. Life would return. Garrick sat without speaking, the chair rocking slow beneath him, Etta Winslow's presence steady at his side. He had poured drinks with one hand, and when the moment demanded, poured justice with the other. He wore no badge now. He claimed no pulpit. But Hollow Ridge knew him for what he was. In a land where justice came slow and blood ran fast, they would say one man stood when others would not. He poured whiskey when comfort was needed, and he drew iron when salvation was required. They once called him Quiet Hale, but after the Cress outfit fell, when they spoke his name with a different word, one that carried farther than the desert wind, whispered down trails and through canyons, until it took on a life of its own. They simply called him a legend. Finally, let me send my deep thanks to you. Thank you for giving your time to this story. Some journeys shape us, and we hope this one left a mark on your heart. There are more paths ahead, more legends of love, hardship, and redemption beneath the western sky. Please subscribe, leave your thoughts, and travel with us once again. Thank you, and God bless. Aviso legal/disclaimer. The stories presented here are creative expressions and may mix historical inspiration with dramatized scenes. iTools contribute to some elements of voice imagery and structure, but every published story is refined by editors and creators to ensure authentic emotional impact. We honor YouTube's policies and do not generate deceptive likenesses or artificial depictions of real people. All audiovisual components are legally licensed. Any use, redistribution, or alteration of this content must be granted through written consent. Your presence here means a lot, thank you, for supporting artistic storytelling.